Hi, my name is Britt Gilman, and I'm the Research Project Analyst at the Deep River Public Library. Since 2022, the Deep River Library and partners have been co-leading this local history project titled Not Born from a Virgin Forest, Deep River and Area's Earliest History. The title of this project is derived from early recorded accounts of Virginia Adams Hunt, who proposed that the area that we now call Deep River had housed families for decades prior to the arrival of the town, and therefore Deep River was not born from a virgin forest. This project was started in response to requests to expand understanding of life in our area prior to 1945. I'd like to thank our partners, the Schoolhouse Museum, the Laurentian Hills Library, Professor Stephanie Adams, Alex Stevens of Deep Tech, the Deep River District Community Foundation, and to the New Horizons for Seniors grant, who generously funded this project and made our work possible. Enjoy. My name is Britt, and I'm the Project Research Analyst for our Not Born from a Virgin Forest research project here at the Deep River Library. For those who are new to the library, in 2022, the library and joint partners received a grant for a local history project. The spirit of this project was to respond to community requests for information and take part in acts of truth and reconciliation. Throughout the project, we've been collecting oral histories from residents who lived in our area pre-1945. And the other component to this project are the in-person events to expand understanding, like the one you're at tonight. Tonight we're joined with sisters Kristen and Hartog and Tracy Kasaboski, who are co-authors of two highly acclaimed social histories told in the form of family memoir. The Cowkeeper's Wish explores their maternal roots in impoverished Victorian England, and The Occupied Garden chronicles their father's family in the Netherlands in World War II. Tonight the sisters will be discussing the nuts and bolts of researching their family's past, where to find information, and how to transform it into a rich and compelling story. In keeping with the Not Born from a Virgin Forest project, they'll also talk about the possibilities for local history research and use specific examples from the Ottawa Valley long before the town of Deep River came into existence. And at the end of the presentation tonight, we'll be doing a Q&A session. So I have some questions prepared, but also I'll be inviting you in the audience to ask questions, so please don't be shy. And we also have a table set up just right over there for book sales and signing. So if you can support the authors by purchasing their book, you're welcome to do so today, and you can get it signed by them as well. So Tracy Kasaboski and Kristen Hartog both grew up in Deep River, where Tracy still resides. And Tracy's been a member of our writers group here for quite some time. And I feel like we've been having talks about your own author event for quite some time now, haven't we? Yeah. So this is special. And Kristen lives in Toronto and is the author of several novels. I met Kristen this week for the first time, and earlier I was telling her, you know when you meet someone in Deep River, and you meet them for the first time, and then you happen to see them again, and again, and again? That didn't happen with Kristen, but it was her books. Everywhere I was going, her books were standing out at me. They're at the Valley Artisans Co-op, and they're lined up so beautifully, and it was really nice to recognize them out in the wild. As co-authors, Tracy and Kristen specialize in bringing history to life through the rich details gleaned from genealogical research. I'm so excited to have them join us tonight. So without further ado, I will welcome Tracy and Kristen to come on up.
So I just want to ask everybody, first of all, can you hear me okay? Or do you prefer I use the mic? This is good? Yes, please. The mic. Okay. Great. Okay, so thank you for that lovely introduction, Britt. And it's really nice to be back here in my hometown with my dear sister and co-author. And lovely to see all of you coming out on such a slushy March, dreary day. Most of you know, and as Britt said already, we're the co-authors of The Occupied Garden and The Cowkeeper's Wish. And they're both social histories, but they're told in the form of family memoirs. Those are the covers up there. And the reason you see two covers of The Occupied Garden is there's very exciting news in our view. We're coming out with a new edition of the book that is about our dad's family history in the Netherlands in the Second World War. So sadly, we have no copies of it here tonight because it's still in production, but we're hoping to have it around very soon. And we've got a sheet over on the table there. If you want to leave your email address, we'd love to get in touch with you and let you know when copies are available. So again, we're really happy to be here to talk about our love of history and of being such tenacious researchers. And hopefully it's a great fit with the library's new project of capturing Deep River's early history. And what we really want to emphasize tonight is the fact that great stories are everywhere around us, and there are all kinds of different techniques that you can employ in order to find them. So you'll be hearing not so much about the stories that our books tell themselves, but about how we went about getting that kind of information and how you might use the same techniques. Not necessarily to write books, but just to find out more about your local community. Oh, I've got to point this way. Okay, so anywhere you go, obviously history is so much richer when you can personalize it with you can personalize the big famous topics with the stories of ordinary people. So we all know, of course, in Deep River what the general history of the place is, especially once AECL arrived, but think how much more interesting it becomes when you learn about the little log house that has sat quietly by the edge of the tennis court for so many years, or John King's farm perched by the highway. The other day, Tracy and I were driving along Bombers Bay Road, and we stopped to take a picture of those two log cabins that are sinking into the ground by the river. And we thought, you know, who belongs to the history of those places? And maybe somebody here knows about those tonight, but what we really hope to convey is how important it is to find the history of those places and to preserve them, because there's so few places around the area that are still in existence from long ago. And we really should treasure those places and search out the stories that go with them. So these are the sorts of things that we want to get you thinking about tonight. How do we find out about the people who lived in our community or in any community long ago? It's still on. Okay.
Okay, we promise not to do that too much. We're certainly not going to flip back and forth every couple of slides. Keep you guys watching us jumping up and down. This slide is a collage of images of the sorts of things you might use if working on a family tree. And while some people might find the process of gathering names and dates a bit boring, genealogy is actually so much more than that. It's a great tool for the telling of a social history or a family memoir. Starting with the basics, what you know and can easily discover, facts, lore, photographs, is essential in beginning to shape the story of your ancestors. Long before we even thought of writing our first book, The Occupied Garden, our mom had an interest in genealogy, and she'd compiled several binders of information about her English ancestors. And I found that really fascinating, and I helped her out with it a little bit. And not really wanting to reinvent the wheel and do what she was already doing, I decided that I was going to delve into my husband's family tree. So unlike our family that came to Deep River in the 1960s, my husband, hiding in the back, came from Old Valley stock, all of whom arrived in Canada easily 100 and more years before he was even born. So they were Polish on one side, Irish on the other, and they were grounded mainly in the Renfrew area. On his father's side, his Polish great-grandfather Simon, in the top hat, arrived here in the 1880s as a teenager and came to own a large farm. And if you're familiar with Renfrew at all, or the Renfrew area, and you know Pinnacle Hill, maybe you've heard of the Pinnacle Hill Bluegrass Festival, that's part of his farm. There we go. Simon married another Polish immigrant, and they had 10 kids, and he died in Renfrew the year he turned 100. Did I flip yeah, I did. Flip twice. Okay. That's okay. My husband's mom had grown up in the Renfrew area too, but she had Irish roots. That's her in the very left bottom screen, catching raindrops, maybe. I don't know. She was only 4'11". That's as high as she got. And in the family, there was lots of good-natured teasing of her about being a leprechaun. And she certainly did love to dance. Anyway, her family came to Canada from Ireland in the 1870s, and like the Polish Simon, they settled on a farm in the Douglas area south of Renfrew. So they were Polish on the dad's side, Irish on the mom's, but of course where genealogy is concerned, it's often not that simple. So on the Irish side of the family, my husband's grandfather Eugene, that's him with the lovely mustache, he'd gone north and he ended up working a J.R. Booth depot farm near North Bay. And while he was there, he met a French-Canadian girl and they got married in 1917. So now the family wasn't just Polish and Irish, they were French-Canadian too, with a history in Canada all the way back to the first settlers that came to Canada in the 1600s. And that was interesting, but it was also the case, I think, for a lot of valley families. And French-Canadian trees are really well documented. If you've done genealogy at all, you know about the Drouin Institute. They've been documenting French-Canadian genealogy for more than 100 years. So anyway, I poked around a bit more and I found another branch, Americans this time, who'd come to the Gatineau area around 1812 from New England. So this was for me where it started to feel a little bit more personal. I followed the French-American line as they bounced around the Gatineau area. I put a blue star there on the far right side to show where they first settled. And then they began to move west along the Ottawa Valley. One family settled in Black Bay in Petawawa. Sorry, I keep moving my head, I know. In the 1850s, and another continued on to Rocher Capitan and de Rivière in the 1860s, which I also marked with a little blue star at the far end of the valley there. Now it was exciting because these lives that I was learning about from 100, almost 200 years ago had been lived in places that were familiar to me and that felt like home. I came across lots of exciting stories. There was one about a Petawawa ancestor who drowned in 1878 trying to save a deer that was caught on an ice floe. And there was, of course, the mystery of the little cemetery that supposedly was my husband's ancestors that you can still see on the side of the road, side of the highway up by de Rivière. And one about an altercation between two neighbors in de Rivière that led to what might have been what I like to call an Ottawa Valley version of the Hatfields and the McCoys. While I was working on all this genealogy, Kristen and I got talking one night about family stories, and we decided we had a great one to tell about our dad's family experience in Holland during the Second World War. And we both agreed it wasn't something that we really wanted to tackle on our own. It felt too big, and both of us were experienced with fiction but had no experience with nonfiction. But we agreed that it might be fun to do together as a collaboration. So that's what we did, and the first seeds of what would become the Occupied Garden were planted. This is our new book cover. Oop, I'm gonna pull somebody's cord out of the wall, that's all we need.
And, it's really nice to be talking about the Occupied Garden. I think maybe some of you will know that our dad died in November, so it's really a special thing that the book keeps living on for so many years. It originally came out in, I think, 2008. So we've always said, because people have always contacted us over the years and told us that they've read the book and been moved by the story, whether they have a Dutch background or not, whether maybe they're just interested in the Second World War or in wonderful family stories. But we've always said, isn't it great how it just keeps on going? But I think now that's even more special because Dad's not with us anymore. So it's really a special thing to be able to tell you a little bit about that tonight. There. So in a nutshell, again, the Occupied Garden is basically about the Netherlands in World War II and one family's path through that time and their eventual arrival in Canada in the 1950s. That's our Oma and Opa there, so our grandparents. And in the late 1920s, they became engaged. They had a long engagement. And they weren't married until the mid-1930s. And by the time they started having their children, the war was about to begin. And some of their children were born during the war. And so they would have grown up, their earliest memories would have been formed in a time of bombings in their town and food, not enough food sometimes, and German soldiers living right across the street, billeted in a neighbor's house. There we go.
Oh, it skipped too. It skipped.
Oh. It's because I'm doing it with my right hand and I'm severely left-handed. Okay, so
I can drive. Do you want me to drive?
Yeah, that would be good.
I'll drive. Okay.
In order to tell this kind of story properly, we of course needed to understand more about the official history. So we dug deep into things like history books about World War II, Queen Wilhelmina's autobiography, and we scoured newspapers and archives and all that official kind of stuff. But we were also lucky enough to have this little treasure trove of documents in our own family archive that we pored over again and again. And our Oma and Opa had been dead a long time by the time we started writing the book, researching the book. But luckily, these things that they had saved, even though they'd never really talked about them, that was very common of people of that generation. They didn't talk about their experiences of the war. So even though that was the case, our aunt, who also has a fabulous, amazing memory, she had saved all of these things, and she was very enthusiastic about us wanting to do this project. And we sat with her, and we went through these little pieces of information from long ago, and we asked her, what can you tell us about each little one? So you can see our Oma and Opa in the corner there. Those are the ID cards that they had to carry during the war years. And up above that is a sharpshooter certificate that our Opa got, and also his army documentation. The orange paper is an underground newspaper, and it's dated, actually I see there it's dated May the 5th, so just when liberation was happening. And the little certificate with their name, the little card with their name on it is their engagement notice. And there's also this mystery postcard that becomes a very important part of the story and has to do with a Jewish neighbor who escaped to Switzerland late in the war. So we went through all of these things with our aunt, and it was just a wonderful way of using physical material and getting someone to talk to us about everything she knew about, every memory that was sparked going through that kind of stuff. Okay, next. And of course, as well as the physical evidence that we had from our grandparents' lives, perhaps the most important thing was people who were left to us. At this time, our dad and all of his siblings were still alive and very happy to communicate with us and be part of this project. And they were by far our most important resources. So even though they were very small children during the war years, they had memories of those days. And of course, they knew their parents better than we ever did, and they could give us impressions of what family life was like for that time, at that time. And but since our dad and his siblings were all scattered in different parts of the world at that time, and I was in Toronto and Tracy was here in Deep River, we started just by asking questions in an email group. And we'd send out these questions and ask them to respond in whatever way they could with any kind of memory. And it was really interesting to see how different their memories were sometimes. They were talking about the same event, but I'm sure you've had that experience too. One sibling remembers things entirely differently. So we found it was very good to ask the questions more than once and ask them in a different way. And that's hopefully something that you can think about as well if you're ever doing this kind of work with someone. Just go over things, keep repeating or keep saying things in a different way, and talk to people in a group and talk to them individually too. So we found that really useful to have. Also, the other good thing about doing it by email was that we automatically had a written record of everything that we asked and all of the answers. And we could go over that in our own leisure too. So, but we would also try to, whenever it was possible, if we could see them in person, we would sit down with them and talk to them and tape record the interviews. And then we would transcribe them, and then we also had that to go on. And different things come up. It really depends on the person that you're interviewing. Some people are better. For instance, I would be way better to answer someone's questions if I was able to sit and write it down. And someone else might be much better if someone just sat and talked to them. So, you have to try different things depending on who your interview subject is. And then it's great to have that written record, because sometimes you don't notice a detail that later becomes important to you, or you realize the value of it because you've been able to knit it together with other information that's come since. So, but it's also really amazing to see how even 60 years later, people can become quite emotional about things that happened to them so many years ago, or maybe happened to someone that they loved. We hadn't really expected that with our family, actually, because they're all quite pragmatic people, and they were all like, oh yeah, I can talk about those things, no problem, even though they did go through some quite dramatic things. Some of you would probably know that our dad lost a leg during the war, and his little brother lost an arm in the same incident when their town was bombed. So he had no problem talking about any of those kinds of things. But we found that actually wasn't the case when we got a little bit deeper into things. And the same with our aunt. That's her in the photo with the big bow. That's the lovely Aunt Riga, who had the phenomenal memory. And she said to us, we were months into our research when she said to us that there was something that she hadn't told us, a family secret that she had been unable to speak about. And she said she didn't know why it was that she couldn't tell us, but she decided she needed to. And that was that our Oma, her mother, had had a sixth child during the war, and the baby was stillborn. And she said, it was something that nobody ever talked about after it happened. And she was very young. She was the oldest, so the brothers were even younger. But she said there was just a feeling of sadness and silence in the house afterwards. And I guess she felt all those years later, because it had never been spoken of, that it was something she wasn't comfortable saying. But after we developed this relationship with her and this back and forth of talking about those days, she realized it was an important detail. And it really was, because it gave us such insight into everything that our grandparents had endured in those times. I mean, can you imagine living under occupation and worrying about your children, and not having enough food for them at times, and bombs dropping, and then on top of that to lose a child? It must have been incredibly difficult. So it gave us real insight into our grandparents. And the same with Dad. When I was mentioning earlier about the bombing and how he always thought, that's no big deal, I can talk about it. And he used to do things when we were kids, like he would turn his foot around backwards and walk with his foot pointing out the wrong way, and those kinds. It was never a big deal. But when we said to him, we're writing the chapter. We're writing the chapter about that day. And we need you to recall everything you can from those moments. What was it really like for you? What do you remember seeing? How quickly did it happen? All of that. And he said, so this is all by email, of course, and he wrote back to say, describing the fact that they were playing outside, and then the noise of the planes coming, and his father calling to them from the window, and then just suddenly it all happening. And once the bombs fell, he said he remembered seeing his shin bone, and he remembered seeing his brother's eyes roll back in his head as his little brother lost consciousness. And in the middle of writing this to us, he said, I suddenly got tears in my eyes and had to keep from crying. Amazing. So he was shocked by his own reaction. He hadn't expected that he had those feelings deep down. So I should say, though, that even though we often asked our family to talk about these difficult things, I think all of us felt, certainly Tracy and I, and Heidi, this is our sister Heidi, helping us with our research too, and my dad and his siblings, we all felt that it had been such a rewarding experience. It's hard to express how much it means to have those deep kinds of conversations about family history. But we really felt closer to Dad and his siblings after that had happened. And I think even once the research was all done, we kept going with this little email group that I told you about, just about everyday things that we wouldn't have written to our aunt and uncles about before. But because we had this connection, we just kept those kinds of, that kind of contact going. So I think these pictures are funny because one is from researching the occupied garden, and the other is from a number of years later researching the cowkeeper's wish. And I always think when I look at them, that looks really boring probably to most people. But for us, it was not boring. It was so exciting. And you get in there and you're just like a dog with a bone trying to get to the thing that you want. And you don't always find the thing that you want, but you might find all kinds of other things along the way that keep your curiosity piqued. So by the end of the occupied garden work, we had already pretty much decided that we wanted to turn around and do it again with Mom's side of the family. So, and that is the cowkeeper's wish. So we knew from Mom that our grandmother had been orphaned during the First World War. And at first, I think we thought we would tell a story that would be very similar to the occupied garden, but around the First World War. So we'd be talking about what it was like to go through that time for an ordinary family, and then what it was like to come to Canada after a war had ended. But once we started doing a bit of research into what our grandmother's childhood must have been like, and looking into the very poor area in London where she lived, we've kept going back a little bit further just to see, oh, well, that's interesting about her mother. Let's see what we can find out about that. And then we go back and see what we could find out about. And we were discovering so many interesting things about relatives sent to insane asylums or workhouses or arrested for watering down their milk and all this kind of interesting stuff. And it just made us want to dig further and further back in time. And so we ended up starting our story with our 3 times great-grandparents, Benjamin and Margaret Jones, who walked from Wales to London with their cows in the 1830s in search of a better life, ostensibly, but of course they landed in a really poor neighborhood. So again, we had to learn about the official history, and we read about Queen Victoria, who was their contemporary, and we learned about the big famous events of the times, and because of course those would have been the things that impacted our family members' lives. And since we were going back to such an early time period, the process of researching the story was very different than it had been for the occupied garden, because of course there was nobody that we could interview who lived back in the 1800s. So we relied on census documents and birth and death records and newspapers and institutional records when we could get them, and we started building the story up from there. And because we were dealing with such a large story and covering such a broad span of time that featured so many different characters, we organized our information on a color-coded chart. And again, like these are the kinds of things we used as writers. You don't necessarily have to be a writer or be writing a book for this kind of tool to come in handy. So it's really great because you see how every branch of the family has its own color. And then also there's another color for broader historical events, like maybe the coronation or the death of the queen or something like that. So what it does is you can see at a glance things that happened at the same time to maybe people who aren't necessarily obviously connected. So you might see that a family member celebrated a birthday on the day of the Queen's funeral, and that gives you color to add to your story. Or you might see that two sisters' babies died right around the time a third sister was having a baby. So then you start to think, well, what must it have been like for those sisters, having some just have lost their babies and others are bringing new babies into the world. And it just gives you a great way to understand a little bit more about your family's world. But to be honest, this chart was Tracy's idea, and when she first came up with it, I looked at it and I thought, okay, you go ahead, but I'm not going to use that because it just looked so busy to me, and I thought, that just makes me feel confused. But then when I sat and actually looked at it and realized how well it worked, I realized what a great tool it was. And I still use the same type of chart now. So I'm working on a book now that isn't family related, but it's a history. It's about actual people. It's a nonfiction book set in the First World War. And it's a really, really useful tool for me. So it's something that I thought, that's not for me, but it works really, really well. And so the other different documents like birth, census, marriage, death, those kinds of things that you would be slotting into the chart, they also show you what occupations your ancestors had. And we found that researching these jobs was a really great way of understanding our characters. We had one relative who worked for Dalton's Pottery, and we were able to read about all the health problems that might be associated with that type of job. So breathing in silica dust, for instance, in the poorly ventilated factory where they worked, sometimes resulted in a horrible disease nicknamed potter's rot. And another relative was a shoemaker. So in order to develop his character more, we tried to find out more about what his little workshop would have been like, what tools he would use, and what boots and shoes would have looked like at that time, and who in a poor neighborhood like our family's neighborhood, who his customers would have been. So this kind of research would be really interesting locally as well. If your family was involved in the logging trade in the Ottawa Valley, you might want to find out, what did that actually mean? What were the different jobs that people had to do? And what were the conditions like for workers? What were the dangers of those kind of jobs? Or what did it mean to work on a depot farm like Tracy's husband's ancestor did, or maybe on a steamboat that went up and down the Ottawa River? So all of those kinds of things are really rich avenues of research. And another great tool, which can also be used locally, is newspapers. You have to be careful though, because they don't always tell the full story, and Tracy will go into that some more too. So sometimes we found our family members themselves mentioned in the newspapers, like our cowkeeper Benjamin that I mentioned, who was charged several times for watering down his milk. Or we also had a great aunt who was carted off to an asylum after drinking problems and troubles with her husband. But if we couldn't find anything specific about our own family members, we'd search out events, dramatic events, or news stories, or sometimes even not so dramatic events that happened in their neighborhood. Because, of course, then and as now, newspapers are a great window into what a community is like. So here's just one example about that. When we visited London, so we were lucky enough to visit London when we were researching The Cowkeeper's Wish, and also to visit the Netherlands when we researched the Occupied Garden. Great, great opportunities. Anyway, when we visited London and we walked through the neighborhood where our family had lived in the 1800s, and we were trying to picture what it might have been like back then, we came across this street called Ayers. And we knew that the name had changed over the years, and we wondered about why. It ran parallel to Red Cross Street, where our family had lived. And after we'd done a little bit of research, we realized that there had been a terrible fire in the neighborhood in the late 1880s. And horse-drawn fire trucks had raced to the scene, and neighbors had gathered in the streets. You can read all about this in the papers. Were watching the flames consume the building, and this young woman appeared in the window, and her name was Alice Ayres, and she was taking care of these little kids who lived in the building. And one by one, she lifted each child through the window and dropped them to safety with the firefighters below. And of course, the crowd is just gathering in the street and screaming to her to jump too. All very dramatic when you read about it in the newspaper archive. And once she had all the children out, she did jump, but she hit her head on the shop sign down below, and she soon died of her injuries. And so the neighbors watched all of this, and we thought to ourselves, there's a really good chance that our ancestors who lived just around the corner from her would have been in that crowd. Or maybe they knew her. Maybe they knew Alice Ayres, or maybe they knew the little kids. So they're the kinds of things that you shouldn't really ignore if you're trying to get a picture. Just don't stay narrow. Don't stay with only the things that involve your own family. Try to put a backdrop behind them and find out what their world was like. So these are the kinds of anecdotes that make you look around your own community and you wonder, how a street or a park or a school or even a town got its name. And what are the stories behind those names? And there are often multiple explanations for those names, and trying to find the right explanation can lead you down some very interesting paths. I'll take this and do the same. Do you want me to drive?
Yeah, you drive. So some of you are more than likely familiar with the CD called The River by local songwriter Mark Audette. And one of the songs on Mark's CD is called Battle Hill. And when I saw the name of that track on the CD, I was immediately interested, because Battle Hill, many of you probably know, is a place in the Big Gibson area of Head Clare and Mariah townships. And I'd already come across references to it when I'd been researching my husband's American-French line. And in researching material for his song, Mark says he came across a variety of explanations for the name Battle Hill, but he chose to interpret the origin of the name as having something to do with the difficulty that the land surveyors had when they were putting the Trans-Canada Highway through to North Bay in the 1950s. And there's no question that it was and still is rugged terrain, but I think the name was around long before that. And I think it had something to do with those ancestors that I told you about earlier, who got into a bit of a Hatfield and McCoy type feud with a neighbor. And I'll explain how I came to this conclusion by going back to my research into my husband's family way back when, and this is not them. This had to do with the Kidder family, who, as I said, had come originally to Gatineau from the States in the early 1880s. They'd worked their way west, most likely in conjunction with the lumber trade, operating farms and stopping places. And one of the branches settled themselves in the township of Clara near Durivière. And they appear there on the 1861 census. I was having a bit of trouble figuring them out, so I'd posted something on one of the Roots web message boards, And I got a response from a man in Petawawa, and his email to me went something like, "Eureka! You're the connection I've been looking for 10 years." So we corresponded and filled one another in with what we knew about the Kidder family, and he very generously sent me a copy of a publication that had been written by a member of the Upper Ottawa Valley genealogical group called Battle Hill Cemetery, Kidder family at Mariah Township. So it referred to that small cemetery I mentioned earlier that's pictured here that sits on the edge of the highway between Stonecliffe and Durivière. And the publication quoted a report about the cemetery written in 1964 by someone working for the Department of Highways, and it says they inquired with locals about those graves, and they were told there were 6 children buried in 5 graves belonging to 2 families, one of which was the Kidders. All the children, according to the locals, had died of black diphtheria. The report says that if that was true, the children had likely died in 1892 when a really virulent form of diphtheria struck the valley. So, thought I, very interesting. And so, of course, I scurried off and I tried to figure out who might be buried in the graves, and I couldn't come up with a decisive answer, although there were a lot of unfortunate deaths within that family from various awful things, like a baby boy who died of malnutrition and a young mother who died in childbirth, and her 4-year-old daughter died just months after that, and 2 cousins who married and then both died of Spanish flu. But none of these deaths had occurred in the 1890s when the Battle Hill Cemetery supposedly came into being. And most of the records I did find referenced a burial within church grounds, so maybe not a little hilltop plot. But always in the back of my mind as I was searching was the name Battle Hill and its significance. And I suppose it could simply have been a reference to the battle that these early settlers had just surviving in this unforgiving terrain and climate. But if that was the case, then the whole Ottawa Valley, I would think, could have been called Battle Hill or Battle Beach or Battle Trail or Battle Woods. At the time that my contact in Petawawa had sent me the UOVGG report about the cemetery, I'd asked him if he knew why it was called Battle Hill, and while he said he didn't know for sure, he said that local lore hinted at a disagreement between 2 families, and so I was even more intrigued. And thinking of the old adage, where there's smoke, there's usually fire, I kept that little tidbit of gossip in the back of my mind, along with the oddly named cemetery that had my spidey senses tingling. And I know from experience that lore is often wrong or imperfect, but there's usually a grain of truth in what you're hearing. The fact that lore has survived in some form is helpful, because when we go looking for the real story, we have something to go on. And that's what happened in this instance. I did eventually get the original 1964 report that was written for the ministry, and it relates a little bit more detail about the local lore that was told by the resident. Now, the report, keep in mind, is written in 1964, so the person sharing the story might have had a closer connection to the event. Maybe it was told to them by a parent or a grandparent. And that report quoted a story of a man named Burton who got into a disagreement with a neighbor. And they decided to resolve their differences by duking it out in an agreed-to location, but when it came time to actually do it, they managed to avoid an all-out fight and came down the hill reconciled. And ever since, so the story goes, the hill has been called Battle Hill. So maybe that's correct. But I have another theory, rightly or wrongly. Years after hearing this vague thread of a story, I came across a newspaper article from 1874 about what sounded like a feud between the Kidder family and a man named Alex Doyle. And for me, it was my eureka moment and what convinced me that this is what the name Battle Hill refers to. I'm going to read that article, and just as an aside, I want you to just listen, just note the biased language and the tone the writer uses, because he's already decided on the guilt of Joseph Kidder. So the headline reads, "A man shot and nearly killed at Durivière," and this is from the Pembroke Observer. Alexander Doyle, the victim of a very serious shooting affray which took place near Deux-Rivières about noon on Tuesday last, came down the river to Pembroke last night on the John Egan. That's a steamer. It appears that some years past he had taken up a lot of land for his son in the vicinity, and after making some improvements on it, returned to his home. Sometime after this, a man named Joseph Kidder, finding this land unoccupied and having a good appreciation of the improvements that had been made, quietly settled on it. Matters went very smoothly until Tuesday last, when Doyle, accompanied by his wife and son, the latter a boy of 16, went to look after his property. The family found Kidder in full possession and determined to remain so. He does not seem to have cared, however, whether his possession was peaceable or not, for he quickly showed his resentment at their appearance on the land by lodging a charge of small shot into the legs of young Doyle. Even this did not satisfy Kidder's yearning for fame and an airy dance at our fine courthouse, for he then fired 2 shots at the elder Doyle, who was removing his son. The first bullet cut away part of his shirt, and the second entered his left hip, passing through it and lodging in the right, so that when the skin was cut, the bullet dropped out. Medical treatment not being available there, he was brought to Pembroke, where the wound was dressed by Dr. Deloge. The wound, although a very serious one, is not fatal, and it is expected that a couple of months will see the injured man well again. 2 constables have been dispatched to arrest the would-be murderer. So it sounds like this Joseph Kidder, my husband's several times great uncle, was a real baddie. But then I came across a newspaper clipping from a few months later, and it sheds a slightly different light on what happened. In the second article, both men are given identical sentences of 3 months hard labor in the Pembroke jail. Kidder for shooting Alex Doyle and his son, and Alex Doyle for shooting Joseph Kidder and his wife. So, not as bloody as the Hatfields and McCoys, certainly, but definitely a difference of opinion on something. And of course, I did dig further, and while I didn't find out anything conclusive, I do know that both families were on the census in Head Clare and Mariah Township in 1861 and 1871, Joseph as a farmer and Alex Doyle as a tavern keeper. So they likely knew one another, probably for many years. A search of land records might clarify the claims of the first newspaper article that suggests the property belonged to Doyle. But for some reason, Alex Doyle and his family moved on, and Doyle became a well-known and somewhat notorious figure in North Bay. Almost 20 years after the altercation with Joseph Kidder, Doyle was charged with manslaughter in the death of a hotel patron, although the charges were later dropped, and some 9 years after that, he was charged with allowing gambling in his hotel. Joseph Kidder, meanwhile, continued to live on the same disputed property, eventually moving in with a niece when he grew elderly and finally dying in Clara Township in 1914. So who shot first and why? Well, we'll probably never find out the whole story, but that's so often the nature of memoir and history. The thing to take away from this is that small hints, like the odd name of the cemetery connected to this family, and then the rumor I'd heard about the disagreement, are clues, and you shouldn't discount them. I haven't finished trying to figure out what happened to this branch of the family. And as anyone who's interested in family stories know, you're never really done. Certainly there's more to this feud than a few newspaper articles can relate. But when stories are not shared, they disappear.
So, as we said earlier, family history is about so much more than just gathering names and dates. And that part of it is very important because it helps you get to the good stuff, the kinds of things that we've talked about a little bit tonight. But even more important than gathering the names and dates is the approach that you take to doing your research. So we really felt some of those qualities are just great to be summed up and outlined. So you need to be curious, and you also need to be tenacious. You need to be unafraid to ask and to re-ask questions, but also be thoughtful and respectful. You need to be methodical and have ways, like the chart that we showed you, of keeping track of your information so that you're not always covering the same territory and going back over things you've already you've already discovered, only to go, oh yeah, I knew that already, but I forgot. So you need to also be meticulous, of course, because one wrong assumption when you're doing genealogy can change your whole lineage. And if you've done that kind of work and you've looked at trees online, you'll see there's so many trees out there that are full of mistakes, that just the things on them just don't add up. But you need to stay open to possibilities also and admit that you could have done something wrong. You might think you know everything there is to know about an ancestor, only to discover, as we did, that that she had a loosey-goosey divorce and took on her common law husband's name, and then had a whole bunch more children who were given that name. So there are so many surprises in family history, which is part of what makes it such an exhilarating and addictive task. There's always the potential for some new juicy tidbit you haven't uncovered yet. And we always try to remember also to both zoom into your story and zoom out. So meaning dig deep into each person's story, find everything out that you can about them through all the tools available to you, but then also back up and put them in the context of their own time. So if your ancestor was found wandering insane like one of ours was, find out what the attitudes were in those times towards mental illness and what it was like to live in an asylum. So by putting your family story in context, you learn not just about your own people, but you learn about the place and the period that they lived in. And I just think what can be more interesting than that? And as I alluded to earlier, this is not necessarily just the kind of thing you can do for people that you're related to. But if you're interested in a period in history, you can find out about people's lives by using these genealogical tools. It doesn't have to be just for a great-great-grandma. It can be for anybody anywhere. So that's really it from us tonight. I hope that you've enjoyed some of the stories that we've shared, and I look forward to hearing your questions if you have any, and I think we're both looking forward to hearing how this wonderful local history project goes with people in the town of Deep River and around. So thanks very much.
If you want, you can have a seat.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll take my glasses back.
Just yes.
Do you want water?
Thank you both. That was wonderful. I have some questions prepared, but again, I will reach out to those in the audience and invite you to raise your hand if you have a question as well. My first question, did you guys use Ancestry websites? And if so, how did Ancestry help you in your research?
Well, I can tell you. Is that going to reach? When I started doing this kind of research, not necessarily for the Occupied Garden and the Cowkeeper's Wish, there was no Ancestry. So it was a matter of sitting and reeling through endless reels of microfilm. But once we got to the Cowkeeper's Wish, yes, not so much for the Occupied Garden.
That's right.
Partly because of the language barrier, we really had to rely on our family for letting us know things. But it was also our parents, so only one generation above us. We knew pretty much what we needed to know about that. We weren't trying to figure out how many children in a family or anything like that. So yes and no.
Yeah. And also the image that you see up on the screen is actually from a tree that we built on Ancestry. So that's, you know, if none of you know, if some of you don't know how it looks, that's how you can make it look. It's a very small little snapshot of a larger tree. And as I think Tracy mentioned too, our mom had done a lot of genealogical research into that side of the family, But what we did, we had to fact check everything that she did. We said, sorry, Mom, we're writing a book and we can't necessarily trust what you've done. So we had to go over everything in detail, right?
The other thing I would add too about using Ancestry is because I've done this kind of research, genealogical research, prior to Ancestry, I know that a lot of what is available out there is not available on Ancestry, and vice versa. So there's more places to look than just Ancestry. And a lot of times, one of the best things you can do is go to a place like the Schoolhouse Museum, or these smaller places that have, you know, whether it's oral histories or written histories, or they have things that just aren't there. So you have to keep in mind like the broader, you know, all the different options.
That's really helpful. Thank you. We do have Ancestry at the library for those that want to use it. Just a plug for our library services. But thank you, that's really helpful. I hadn't thought of how some of those documents, and like you mentioned, oral histories will be accessible on Ancestry. I know you mentioned that in your historical research, you sometimes notice that some family members had different perspectives on an event happening. Is there one in particular that you would like to share with us, and maybe how you chose to portray it in the writing? Just to put you on the spot.
Well, the one that comes immediately to mind is in the occupied garden, and it is the day of the bombing.
That's what I was thinking of too.
Different siblings had quite different memories of what happened that day, and I think the way we chose to portray it was just by saying that maybe this happened, or this character, if you like, you know, this particular sibling remembers it this way, and yet this sibling remembers it this way. So there's no way to know who's right at this point in time, so we just tell it like it is.
And I think that's also just a really important general rule for us, that we never felt like we could get all the answers to everything. And to me, that's what keeps it interesting. There's always some little bit that you don't know. So we chose to, we could have written novels about our family history, but we decided we wanted to tell true stories, but we also just wanted to be honest with our readers about where the blank spots are, where there's something that can't be known. And I think when we really struggled with that chapter about the day of the bombing, and we ended up telling it in very little fragments, it's a funny way to put it, from all these different perspectives that we had from people, neighbors that we interviewed so many years after the event, all Dad and all his siblings, everywhere where we could get a little bit of information, including from a little tidbit from the bombers that came over, a little bit from their logbook. So all these different things served to create a picture of what was happening that day. And when something so dramatic happens, I think people realize there isn't a clear answer to how it was, because it all happens so fast, and everybody's just flooded with trying to process what's going on.
Give a quick example of something very just different about that, like a detail that was different.
So I think Uncle Nick remembered, he was the youngest child, and he remembered that he was in his crib, and that his crib filled with glass because the windows in the house broke. And someone else said, it was Uncle Rokas, who said, no, you couldn't have been in your crib because you were sitting across the table from me and we were playing a game together. Mm-hmm. And then there was also something about Uncle Rokas ducking and a sheet of glass flying overhead. So all these different little, I think you know what that's like when you have these something happened in your childhood, you have a really strong visual of what it was, and somebody else says, well, no, you weren't even there that day, or something like that. So we don't, it's hard to know. We can't go back and live it over again and find out what actually happened. So you just have to write it in a way that brings that forward. And I think that ended up being a really lovely poetic thing about that chapter.
I really admire how you appreciated and acknowledged everyone's perspectives and choosing to do it that way. So thank you. I know you mentioned that you're both working on something new together. Is there anything that you'd like to share about the current research and writing process for that project?
Do you want to go first? Well, we're not working on something together. We are working on a new edition of The Occupied Garden, which is very exciting and will be out. It's actually out as an ebook right now, but it'll be out as a paperback hopefully in the next month or so. But we're working on our own separate projects. So I'm working on a nonfiction book about the Christie Street Hospital in Toronto, which was a military hospital that was opened at the end of the First World War. And it was an old cash register factory that was converted to a hospital because there were so many wounded men coming home, there was not enough space to put them all. So this hospital, it's no longer, the building is no longer there, but I've been researching the men who were patients there, and I've been researching the nurses and doctors and massage therapists and all the different people who cared for them. And that's been a really fascinating project, and that book will come out next year, hopefully. But it's really interesting for me because I live in Toronto, and it's right near my neighborhood, so I can walk to that spot and kind of try to imagine how it was back in those days.
Well, after we finished The Cowkeeper's Wish, and I went back to this genealogy that I had been working on for my husband's family, I wanted to do something with that. So I wanted to either do something similar to those two books, but it felt enormous. And I couldn't, I mean, just with the four threads of the family, I just couldn't seem to figure out where to start, and it just felt like a huge project. And then I thought, okay, maybe I'll do it fictionally. And so, I was still sort of poking around, finding out information, and my plan was to start going to some of these places. I had a friend who was living in Gatineau, and she said, come on down, we're gonna go, there's a Kidder Lake out here, we're gonna find out all this stuff. And then COVID shut everything down, so I wasn't able to go, anywhere to any of these heritage sites or archives or anything like that. And everything at that time, I'm sure, felt for everybody, it just felt depressing and heavy and awful. And I thought, I don't want to do any of this, and I shoved it to the side, and I proceeded to start a fiction project, which I'm almost finished. I'm really excited about, and it's a sort of escapist kind of thing of a story about a man in England in the 1920s who hops on a vintage motorcycle and takes off on an adventure, and it's been a really fun project. I actually connected with another writer in England, who wrote a book about that very thing, driving around England on a vintage motorcycle. It's one of his hobbies. And so we had a bit of back and forth. He sent me his book. It's been a lot of fun, and it's still ongoing, but yeah. And then there's the writers group too, which is always lots of fun.
Those both sound like very interesting and exciting projects, so that's great. I wondered, what was the family reception like for both of your books, and how did your family react?
Really well, actually. I'd say with both of the books. With the Cowkeeper's Wish, because it was so far removed, it was a couple of generations gone, and pretty much everyone had passed away by the time it came out. But people were supportive and interested, and it was great. And The Occupied Garden, even more so, I would say. It was just a generation closer. But I think because of the collaboration that we'd had over the course of writing the book with, you know, all the main characters, so to speak, like our dad and his siblings, and again, the main characters who were their parents had passed away. So there was a little bit of hesitation initially with some of the siblings about how their parents would feel to have this story told, because they were very private people. And the final decision on that was that while they would have been uncomfortable with having their personal story told, they understood that the greater story, the wider story, was important, and they would have been, I think, supportive of our project and happy that we had taken something like that on. So, yeah.
I think also, I remember being quite nervous, especially when The Occupied Garden came out, because when you write a novel, which I had written only novels up until that point, and you're nervous because you think you want people to like it and you don't want anybody to say anything bad about it, but you made it up. So it's different. And when a book like The Occupied Garden comes out, and it's about real people who are still alive, you feel this sense of responsibility for telling their story in a way that they would approve of. But you also have to tell it honestly. So when, like our character, our Oma, was a really difficult woman, a very strict mother in a lot of ways. She loved her children fiercely, but not necessarily tenderly. And I think we were a little bit nervous about, how is this going to sound? Are people going to think she was an awful woman? But I don't think that happened at all. I think people realized how difficult her life was. And because we told the story truthfully and we put in those kinds of details, it made it richer. And the other thing that came to mind just about The Cowkeeper's Wish on our mom's side, and how it's true that, all of those, the people that we were writing about were really from a much earlier time, there was still, I remember being at my Aunt Jean's place. This is my mom's sister. And she lives in not a big fancy place, but a nice house in London, Ontario. And it was after The Cowkeeper's Wish had come out, and I was in London, I was doing a reading there or something, and I was staying with her. And she said, I just can't get over how every day I look around my house now and I think, I'm so lucky. I'm so fortunate for everything that I have. And she said she didn't really used to think about that. It was just sort of a given that this is the way most of the people around me live. But she says now, knowing the poverty that we come from in that family and the things that those people endured, it just makes you go like, how did we get there? We're part of that line and we're okay now. So, yeah.
Was there anyone in the audience that had a question for? Yes, Celine.
I'm curious how you guys handled the language barrier, especially going over to the Netherlands. Like, I imagine there's a lot you could do talking to family, but then going over and diving into the archives. How did you handle that?
Well, we don't speak Dutch at all, so
We can pick out a few words
Yeah,
in there.
but certainly not where you would feel like confident in reading material.
Yeah.
So we totally relied on our entourage that was with us, and that was our dad, our aunt, our uncle, and we visited archives, different kinds of archives,
Yeah.
and in that respect it was difficult because you had to rely on other people to pull things out for you. Whereas with the Cowkeeper's Wish, because it's our language and everything was in English, there was almost too much stuff there that you could access. So
That's why we ended up going back 200 years.
yeah,
Not
right.
knowing where to
yeah.
stop.
So the language barrier was definitely an issue in that book, and we just really relied on. I mean, all through writing the book, anytime we'd come across something, we would send it to Aunt Riga and say, "What does this say?" You know.
Yeah.
So it was difficult.
And I think she was unusual. Actually, I mean, our dad and his siblings are all this way. If you get them interested in something, they're all like. And so we all went around the Netherlands in this little group, and we were just, all of us really into it. But Aunt Riga, she was just tireless, and she was just willing to give everything she possibly could.
Yeah.
And I think that was unusual.
Yeah.
But lucky for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wonder if in your books, and forgive me, I haven't read either of those books, but were you shaping the narrative towards any theme, or did any theme appear as you furthered your research?
I'll let you, because I think I know what you're going to say, but.
Well, I mean, with The Occupied Garden, it's a much more contained story. So it's really a story about a family's journey through the war period. It's set in a pretty short amount of time. But with The Cowkeeper's Wish, because it went back to such an early time period, we sometimes said that to each other as we were going through that research journey. Like, what is this about? And then after we'd done enough of our research, I think it became very clear that it's a story about poverty and about how poverty and a family trying to get out of poverty is just an enormous struggle. And the big thumb is down on people who live at that bottom level. So it's about people in workhouses and, as I said, insane asylums that were not necessarily insane. Just people living through really, really difficult times, and how you end up, things end up happening to you because you're poor and because you have no way out of a situation.
The only thing I would add to that is that we didn't go into the story with that intention, but the more research we did and the more we found out about the families, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong part, I don't have my glasses on, the more that the poverty became a thread through everything that we found, and it sort of bubbled to the surface, and it just was the thing that the book was going to be, not necessarily about, but it was definitely there. So you couldn't ignore it. I think of all the different maybe side themes that you might think about, that was probably just the one thing that was really
stitched it all together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. This is kind of a random one, but it was a question about one of your slides in your presentation. You guys talked about there was like a pottery, not a factory, but like a pottery business, and there was a bunch of people that passed away from this this disease. Do you guys have any background on that, or any how that affected people or anything like that? Like, what was that disease? I can't remember exactly what it was called.
Yeah, it was called Potter's Rot.
Yeah, that was
And
one of the nicknames for it. Yeah.
Yeah, it had to do with the silica that's in the clay, and when they breathe it in enclosed areas, improper ventilation, you suck it in and it settles in your lung, I think is how it went, and it kind of builds up and builds up and builds up until there's no space left in your lung anymore. Yeah.
But interesting too that it was so prevalent with people who worked in that industry that it got the nickname Potter's Rot. But that was another thing that was interesting about the research with the Cowkeeper's Wish, because there were so many poor people in the Victorian period, in London especially. There were also all kinds of philanthropists and do-gooders going around and collecting information about people who were living in poor conditions. They would research about their housing conditions and their occupations and that kind of stuff. So there are all kinds of old books that you can find online that tell about all of those interviews and philanthropists, like I say, going around trying to make the world better for those people. So there's just such a wealth of information to draw on. Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Yeah.
How do you succeed to work together?
Yeah. How do you succeed to work together?
How do you?
Yes.
That's a research about one living here, the other in Toronto. So how was the result that it was a unity?
Yeah. Do you want it?
Yeah, sure.
We've just been working together all week on this presentation, so it was like a flashback to those books.
Yeah, it's a common question. It's one that we get asked all the time, because it's not always easy to work with somebody. So as far as how do we do it, we were doing it by email. So emailing a document back and forth, using the track changes feature on Word. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. And then, so one of us would work on it for a week, send it to the other person. They would go back over what we did and then continue it along and then write some more. So it was a constant, this kind of thing of editing and then when that's fine when you agree with what the person wrote and you just, accept change, and that's great. Oh, you did a good job. Like, that's lovely. I'm going to continue on. But there weren't always.
She changed that. That was great.
and that was hard sometimes, because you would write something and you would think, oh, that's great. Like, whoopee, look at me go. and then you'd send it to her and she'd come back and change it or suggest that it had to go. So sometimes it really depended. You had a discussion, or you didn't. Maybe there was, maybe once you read through and you had time to kind of calm down and, give it a day and read it over, and you think, yeah, she's right. No, she's right. That doesn't belong there, or that needs to be said differently, or, what have you. Or sometimes you make your case and you say, no, I really believe, and this is why. Yeah. And so you kind of go back and forth that way. I think the key to it for the two of us is respect for each other's work and styles. That they're not the same, but I think we managed to, in both books, because of this sort of constant editing of one another's work and working together that way, I think it's pretty seamless.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's she wrote that and then she wrote that. It has to feel like it's coming from one place.
Yeah, because people often say that. Well, what did you do? You write one chapter and she wrote the next? No, not at all.
But I also think that being in separate places the way we were was really key Because we tried, a few times we tried to work, if I would come to Deep River and we'd say, oh, well, let's try to do some work on the book. And we'd sit there and one of us would be sitting there typing, the other one would be over the shoulder, you know, like, well, don't say it like that, say it like that. Oh. But so having, and also having the space, so like Tracy said, when you'd send off your beautiful words and you get them back a week later with all kinds of lines through them, at first you're really like, oh, how could she do that? But then, because we weren't together in the room, we could just have time with it and sit with it for a little while. And I mean, I always feel like, well, I shouldn't say I always feel. I feel the same as Tracy. If I've written something that I think is great, it hurts at first when somebody doesn't think it's great. But to have your work properly edited is really important, and to be able to see what's wrong, to be able to step back from it and take that criticism, because you should want it to be as good as it can possibly be. And a fresh pair of eyes will almost always point out something that you can improve on.
Do you have an editor as well? Did your publisher supply you with an editor in addition? So it wasn't just you, there was a third party.
That's right, yeah. So after we submitted our manuscript to the publishing house, then it would go through a period of editing, and then it would go again through copy editing and proofreading. So it gets a lot of going over. But I think we're presented very polished manuscripts, and partly because we already had each other editing each other's work. So
I was wondering about like hours, years, and the expenses. Like, do you have to pay to get copies from the archives, and like in Netherlands and wherever?
yeah, there can definitely be expense involved, right? It depends. I mean, some places you go and it's free. Some places you can even go online and access things for free. Other times you have to pay. It really just depends on the kind of thing you're looking at.
And weeks, years, hours? Like
Years.
How to distract your days?
For the writing process?
Yeah, like, and the research.
Oh, yeah, like 10 years.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
You see what I mean with by dogs with a bone. But and like Tracy was saying earlier about how refreshing it was to write a novel, to write something that you're just making up. I mean, that's so liberating after the kinds of books that we've been working on, where you really feel like you want to get everything right. So you want to be really, really careful and scrupulous. So it's just a wonderful freeing feeling to be able to just make it up. It can be whatever you want it to be. That's nice.
Or based on a true story.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Any other questions? No? I will leave some time for us to do book sales and signing over there, and maybe you have a personal question you'd like to ask Tracy and Kristen. Thank you both so much for your time tonight. This was certainly illuminating and very educational. So thank you.
Thank you.